Hello, I'm Ollie and this is Criminolly, where I talk about crime, pulp, horror, that kind of thing. Today, my thoughts on the extreme horror genre and a request for recommendations. So if you've watched the channel for any length of time, you will know that I'm a huge fan of the horror genre. It's a kind of book that I've loved for about 40 years. There's something about books with ghosts, with monsters, books that scare me, books that creep me out that I really enjoy. But I have been critical in the past on the channel of what I've labelled the extreme horror subgenre. And I've started to challenge myself a bit on that and explore my thoughts about it a bit more. So I wanted to talk about that in this video today and also get recommendations from you for extreme horror books I might enjoy. I've joined up recently with the r/extreme horror lit subreddit on Reddit, and I had some really interesting conversations with people there in an attempt to try and define in my own mind what extreme horror is. So I wanted to start in this video with that definition. So if you think about the horror genre generally, it's a really broad genre. You've got, someone like Stephen King, who probably sits, kind of broadly in the middle of it. And then you've got someone like Darcy Coates on the cosier end of the scale. So books that are recognisably horror, but that have kind of hopeful themes, that have found families and stuff like that in there. And then you've got someone like Jack Ketchum on the other extreme, who writes books that are very graphic, very dark, very bleak. But the horror genre as a whole is a really broad genre. And then you've got another type of book, a type of book I talk about on the channel quite a lot, which I would label disturbing books. So books that go out of their way to explore themes that are, really dark, disturbing, taboo, but that aren't necessarily books that are, you would call horror books. So in my disturbing books tier list video, for example, that I did a while ago, I talked about a load of books that nobody would call horror books, but which are definitely really disturbing books. So I think where extreme horror sits is in the overlap between those two circles, if you like. So extreme horror books are books that are recognisably part of the horror genre, but that also are, more extreme in terms of the graphicness of their depiction, their descriptions of violence, but that also explore some of these really dark themes. And the kind of themes that, consistently turn up in disturbing books and in extreme horror books are things like sexual abuse, cannibalism, incest, that kind of thing. Really dark, horrible stuff. Stuff that we know goes on in society, but we often just don't want to think about. So yeah, I think that is now my kind of definition of extreme horror. Is it's the overlap between horror and disturbing books. And with that better definition of extreme horror, I've come to realise that there are extreme horror books that I really admire. So the work of Jack Ketchum, so things like Off Season and The Girl Next Door, Let's Go Play at the Adams by Mental W. Johnson, Exquisite Corpse by Poppy C. Bright, all books that I think are recognisably extreme horror, and which I think are excellent. The thing I think that has confused my brain on this a bit in the past is there's another type of extreme horror which definitely sits within that extreme horror overlap, but which I would call like self-defined extreme horror. So authors who use the fact that they label their books as extreme horror as a selling point. And there is clearly a not necessarily a huge audience for this kind of book, but a dedicated audience. There are lots of people who really enjoy reading books that are, really graphic, that really push the envelope in terms of their violence, and who, come back and read authors who write that kind of book again and again and again. So I've read a few books that are in that kind of, self-defined area within, that subset of the extreme horror area. So authors like Matt Shaw and Aaron Beauregard. And I've been critical of both of those authors on my channel in the past. And that's why one of the reasons I'm making this video today is to try and get recommendations for similar authors whose work I may enjoy more. So let me talk a bit about those two authors in particular and the problems I've had with their work. So I've read The Slob by Aaron Beauregard and I've read Octopus and Sick Bastards by Matt Shaw. The Slob, I thought, had some really good writing in it, actually. I thought the build-up was really good. But then when it gets into the kind of scenes of violence, so it's about a woman who she's like a vacuum cleaner salesperson. And she is like going door to door selling vacuum cleaners, and she gets kidnapped by this villain, the Slob, who imprisons her and tortures her basically. And those scenes of torture just go on and on and on, and are ridiculously graphic, like incredibly graphic. I don't necessarily have a problem with graphic violence, but I found often the graphic violence in extreme horror books just seems to be implausible. It seems to be just ridiculous, like impossible, and it just goes on and on and on. One of the observations I've made on the channel before, which I stand by, is the fact that one of the problems with reading violence in books, or seeing violence on screen to an extent, is I find personally I'm more affected by violence that I can imagine happening to myself. So to give you an example, I know what it feels like to get a paper cut. Yeah, I know what it feels like to get a paper cut on my finger. I've done it loads of times. So I can remember that sensation. I can imagine what it would feel like to get a paper cut on my eyeball. And that like really creeps me out. It's really horrible, yeah? What I can't imagine is what it would feel like to have my belly slit open and someone pull my guts out and, whirl them around in the air, which is the kind of thing that sometimes happens in extreme horror books. So I think sometimes being a bit subtler with the horror can make it more effective. Anyway, yeah, so The Slob I thought was, had some good points, but just went on too much. Similarly with Matt Shaw's books, I just found that I've just become... they just feel like a laundry list of horrible things with no real purpose, no real tension, no real character development. And have found that I'm just not engaged by the books as a result of that. So I'm really keen to get recommendations from people to, so other extreme horror authors who I may enjoy. There's a couple who are kind of on my radar. One is Daniel Volpe, I think you pronounce his name, and the other one is Judith Sonnet. So if you've read books by them, do let me know if you think they are ones that I should check out, and also let me know if there are other self-labelled extreme horror authors that you think I should try. I am keen to explore this kind of subgenre more because it is definitely a really vibrant part of the horror genre at the moment, and in particular of the indie horror genre. There are lots of indie writers like Matt Shaw who make, I imagine, a pretty decent living writing this kind of book because they have dedicated audiences. They have audiences who want to go back and read that kind of thing again and again and again, which is fine, whatever floats your boat. And I was trying to think of a good analogy for this. And the one I came up with was kung fu movies, like martial arts movies. So when I was younger, was a big fan of martial arts movies. And when you are a fan of martial arts movies, you watch them for the fight scenes. That's why you're watching them. And you are less critical of other parts of, other aspects of filmmaking than you would be of a non-martial arts film. Because what you care about is the fight scene. So if the acting isn't great, so be it. If some of the dialogue's a bit cheesy, it doesn't really matter. What you're there for is the fight scenes. And I think the same thing is probably true for fans of extreme horror. They are reading those books for the extreme horror. So if some of the characterization isn't perfect, then that's less of an issue than it would be if they were reading a non-extreme horror book. I think that's why people like Matt Shaw, whose writing, frankly, I don't think is brilliant, can build and maintain a really dedicated fan base, because there are people who want to read the kind of thing they are delivering and are less critical of some of the other aspects of the writing than there might be otherwise. And I should say there are some extreme horror authors whose work I have enjoyed. So I did like The Resurrectionist by Ruth James White, and also Dead Inside by Chandler Morrison. And I think both of those would be authors who would be recognised as extreme horror writers. Do let me know in the comments if you've got other recommendations for me. And as always, thank you very much for watching. I hope you're safe and well out there. I hope you're reading good stuff, and I'll speak to you again very soon. Cheerio.